a great pleasure to start the afternoon session with three great presentations. And again, I'm going to ask the presenters to give their three presentations first and then ask questions. I think there's quite a lot of cross-fertilization between the different presentations. I think it's interesting to compare and to contrast. And we're going to start with Saskia Huc-Hepher, who's a senior lecturer in French at the University of Westminster. Her teaching specialisms range from applied French and translation to online international collaboration and contemporary French culture. She's been involved in various digital projects, including web archiving projects around French web archives, in JISC-funded, the JISC-funded project Analytical Access to the Domain Dark Archive, and the IHR-led Big UK Domain Data in the Arts and Humanities project. And her presentation today is on Community Reborn, Archiving the London French Web.
Great, thank you for the introduction. So, I'm Saskia from Westminster, and I've been doing research on the French community in London. And I'm going to talk to you today about how using web archives has contributed to my own research on the community. So, for those of you who don't know the UK Web Archive, I'll just introduce the talk with a bit of context. So, it was created in 2004. Largely in response to the US Internet Archive, which itself was created in 1996 and was harvesting the entire World Wide Web and effectively taking ownership of all of this data until the British Library realised that really the British Library should be in ownership of UK domain data. So in the early noughties, JISC actually bought all the .uk data from the Internet Archive and created what is now known as the UK Web Archive. The idea behind the archive is to future-proof against what's known as a digital black hole, just as the British Library holds copies of all physical publications. It felt it was the right place to house all this digital information that we now produce on a daily basis. It offers researchers a dependable platform for fragile web objects. As we know, websites, I think Thea mentioned it before, are susceptible to change, and you can go to a website, start analysing it, and then go back 6 months later and it's a completely different entity or has undergone some changes. So because the Web Archive takes regular snapshots of internet websites, which they call instances, it means that you can look at a specific image of a website and also dig into deeper layers of that website at a specific point in time, which is a very useful and stable platform for researchers to use. The overarching mission of the UK Web Archive, in its own words, is to reflect the diversity of lives, interests and activities throughout the UK, hence the commissioning of a few special collections. So some of these are around particularly important national events. I think the general election has a collection, the Diamond Jubilee. There are also ones which reflect this idea of diversity a bit more. So there's one called Women's Issues and another one on Latin America, UK. And then I came along and decided that we needed one to reflect the French community in London and decided to curate a special collection for that community. Because my research is on a diaspora and because some researchers refer to the diasporic experience as a third time space because migrants are neither here nor there and tend to straddle both spaces, I feel that in today's society, this is heightened by the use of the internet, and you can't study a community, a diasporic community, without acknowledging this digital space. And so that's what I did. That was my intention behind curating this collection. And as I curated it, it occurred to me that it was actually of value in ways I hadn't necessarily anticipated. So it was a valuable exercise in terms of process. The actual curation of the collection turned out to be an ethnographic, immersive experience in its own right. So looking for different blogs or different institutional websites and then seeing what they were linked to and then what they were linked to actually immersed me in this whole world, which I wouldn't necessarily have been aware of if I hadn't undergone this process of curation. And then the idea of creation, obviously there's an output, and that's the collection itself. So the idea of it being a useful product, not only for my own research, but for other researchers and for the wider community, was an important part of the project. And then triangulation. I think it's important for linguists, perhaps especially, but also other scholars who are used to their own methods, to be aware that using web archives doesn't have to be an end in itself. You can use the data and the findings from that data to triangulate, to confirm, substantiate more traditional methods and more traditional findings, which is precisely what I did. And useful also as a comparison tool, because, as I mentioned, the Wayback Machine and the UK Web Archive take regular snapshots of websites. You can not only compare websites over time, so some of them might date back to 1996 and they might still exist today in 2017, so you've got a long expanse of time to look at there, but also you can compare archives with each other and their versions of the same materials. So the US Internet Archive capture could be compared with the UK capture, and in turn that could be compared with the internal archive in a blog, for example. So all of these tools can actually reveal interesting meanings that you might not necessarily be aware of. And the final way that I've begun to use the archive is for link analysis, so using the historic archive that JISC bought. I've managed to get a whole spreadsheet with all the links. I used the French Lycée as a case study, so all the links to and from the French Lycée website to see whether or not it was more inward-looking and exclusive than perhaps other bilingual schools in London. And I need to continue that research. But this is interesting, I guess, because it's not qualitative and it's not quantitative. It's somewhere in between. It's kind of meso level of analysis, which is quite often overlooked. So I created my corpus, and I was pleased with my overall kind of collection that I'd created, but I was then presented with the problem of analysis and how I was going to analyze these digital web objects. And to address this, I first of all came up with a framework which I've called an ethnosemiotic paradigm. And I brought together the idea of habitus, primarily, which is Bourdieu's idea, and merged that with Günter Kress's multimodal social semiotics. And that was very useful for, obviously, studying websites and looking at their inherent multimodality. As we can see from these examples here, there's text, there's images, sometimes there's sound to accompany a website, sometimes a moving image might be embedded within a website. So even though we're trained to analyse texts, we're not necessarily trained to analyse such content.
Okay, well, with apologies to Saskia, who's had a presentation cut in half, I'm going to ask her to continue from where she left off, and if she wants to go back, that's up to her. Thank you.
Okay, can you still hear me? Yeah, excellent. Well, that was a first. So I was saying that websites are inherently multimodal, and multimodal social semiotics addresses that dimension. I suppose for language specialists and linguists, it's perhaps quite disconcerting demoting language from the pinnacle and taking it down to, as I've said here, part of this semiotic whole. It's only one element of the semiotic orchestration. However, as linguists, it's very interesting to look at that interplay between words and between images on the web objects, and indeed between languages themselves. Translanguaging was mentioned earlier, and that's something that I'm interested in, this fluidity of language use in blogs, for example, but also on more formal websites. Some of them decide to publish in French, some of them in English, some of them move fluidly between the two, and that's an area that I'm interested in looking at further myself. And I suppose also that multimodality acts as a counter-narrative to what Crawford calls data fundamentalism. So big data has become something of a buzzword in recent years, and I think the kind of small approach, the highly analytical approach that multimodality requires and that linguists are used to doing comes as a welcome kind of antidote to that big data. And big data itself, it can produce some very interesting results, but it can also be paradoxically limited. So, plain sailing so far? Well, almost. Some unexpected hitches on the way. Web archives do carry risks and limitations for researchers. I hinted at that a moment ago when I mentioned this idea of the bigness of the data and its limitations. And Anderson refers to this as the data deluge phenomenon. And when you're dealing with a web archive, it is very, very big data. If you do a simple keyword search, you're likely to have hundreds of thousands of results, most of which won't be that relevant or pertinent to your own work. I found personally that using French as in my keywords limited the results in a useful way for me. But you need to be aware that if you're going to use web archives for your research, that it's big, it's unwieldy, and it's messy data, and there's no Google technology to help you prioritize that data, which is good and bad in different ways. But it needs to be addressed, and it does take time. And also, this was mentioned before, when you're dealing with web data, you're dealing with reborn digital objects. So they are versions of the live web, and they're not the live web itself. So just as the French community on land is reborn in its online embodiment, so born digital data is reborn in digital web archives. And this can lead to different versions, which can be interesting itself, but it can also lead to incomplete versions, as we see here. So these two images are both contained in the London French Special Collection, and the smaller one at the top is how it was initially archived in 2014, and this is how it looks last week, the blank version there. I've been in touch with the British Library, and apparently this is a technical issue and they're looking into it, but it's quite random. Some of the web resources are complete and as they were originally captured. So it's akin to dealing with a physical archive where the materials you're using might not necessarily be in the best condition. The same happens when looking at digital objects. Ethics, again, I think is another issue. In some ways, my collection overcomes that because it's a permissions-based collection. So all the special collections require the website owner to give permission to appear in the British Library, and they're aware that their resources might be used by researchers. So you overcome a lot of the ethical hurdles. Nevertheless, there are still tensions between anonymity and acknowledging intellectual property, for example, and how do we overcome that kind of tension. Credibility and traceability also emerged as being problematic at times. Sometimes I would come across a comment on a blog post that looked like it was written by a French Londoner, but there was no way of necessarily proving that it was written by a French Londoner. So that can be another problem or limitation. And although the London French Special Collection permissions were useful in terms of ethics, when it came to the final curated collection that I have, it was actually problematic because I think of these 68 resources which are currently there are almost 300 which I nominated. And most of those website owners just didn't reply to the request. I don't think it was that they deliberately didn't want to be in the archive, but it just, fell to the back of the email inbox. So that's another problem if you want to create a corpus of that kind. And then the final potential problem, I guess, is the possible conflict between the agendas of the institution and the agenda of the researcher and even the community itself. So when legal deposit legislation was passed in 2013, which meant that the British Library could collect all the .uk data without asking for permission, which is obviously costly and cumbersome, they were very happy about that. I was less happy because I'm very keen for my collection to be open access and available on the World Wide Web, whereas all the Web Archive data harvested under legal deposit, you can only access in the legal deposit libraries. So the 7 ivory towers, which will reduce the potential visitors quite considerably. So the British Library here, the Bodleian in Oxford, etc. So those are the risks and limitations that I've discovered on my journey. However, I think the positive implications outweigh those limitations. So by studying web archives and digital data in web archives, we're bringing languages research into the 21st century. As mentioned by Claire at the very beginning, this means that we're no longer limited to the study of traditional texts, be they literary or otherwise, and we can look at new research objects and in turn new texts and in turn new forms of communication and discourse. And as I mentioned, I'm very interested in seeing how language is transformed over time, and you can do that by using web archives. And as we see here, how technology can have, and the device you use can have effect on the type of language used. So avant, je savais bien écrire, puis un jour j'ai eu un téléphone portable, et depuis il s'est produit quelque chose de bizarre. And that's a whole new field for us to use in our research or in the classroom, because I'm sure students would be interested in having that kind of colloquial speech when they enter on their embark on their year abroad. And as mentioned at the beginning as well, web archives give us access to new intercultural and new transnational spaces. So I've been talking about the UK Web Archive, but Belgium is in the process of creating their own Belgian National Archive. There's a Spanish one, there's the BNF in Paris, which has one. And of course, the American Internet Archive is a charity, and that is open access, and it does collect captures of the entire web, so any researcher can go and look at materials on there. And it gives us a certain amount of stability and accessibility, so we hopefully are able to look at the same material iteratively, return to it without it undergoing any significant changes. And they give us, obviously, web objects that are on the archive, insights into public and personal representations of contemporary history. So I made a point in my collection of trying to include a holistic representation of the London French community. So you'll find, as I mentioned, the French Lycée website is in there, the French Institute, so kind of formal representations, but also blogs, amateur dramatic societies, charities, Ici Londres, media. There's an artist who has her website in there. So it's as holistic as it could have been given the permissions hurdle. And as Hein pointed out in her book, using this kind of data is unobtrusive and non-reactive. It's effectively found data. So you could argue that it gives the researcher increased objectivity, for example, in relation to an interview, where the interviewee might answer in a way that they feel you want to hear as the researcher rather than what they actually think. And by looking at forums and comments and blogs, you can have a more impartial look at what is going on. And then the other positive implication, I guess, of my collection was the impact, its impact value, which exceeded my expectations. So for me, I guess the most important dimension to this is the contribution it makes to community construction. When I was doing my interviews and focus groups, it became apparent that most of the French people in London I spoke to acknowledged that there was a French community, but it was over there in South Kensington and they weren't part of it. And by creating this web collection and inviting people to nominate websites, which they still can do, it gives them a sense of shared identity, collective identity, and contributing constructively to that identity. Also, the notion of authority and authorship and how it's challenged by creating this sort of resource. Former fixed boundaries between author and reader, or between authority versus the amateur, become hazy. Here we have the example of the British Library recognising some London French blogger who would usually not have been archived in such a site of national heritage and memory. Similarly, the visitor comes to these web objects in a different way. It's not like reading a book from start to finish where the pathway is laid out for us in advance. We take ownership of how we navigate the websites, and we create our own stories as we're moving through this data. Awareness raising was also another important aspect with potential impact. So the French community, despite it being very present on the ground and having a strong cultural presence, is actually a somewhat invisible community. And by making this web archive, and I was told last week that the British Library are going to make the special collections even more prominent on their website. By doing that, we're raising awareness of the French community in London. And unexpectedly to me, it's also been used as a political tool. The French government, when it was launched, and the French embassy actually invited me for a meeting with them at the embassy, and I spoke to the vice-consul who wanted to, in his words, use the archive to gauge the temperature of the community on the ground. I'm not sure if he's been able to do that. But, and the government representative was asked to report back to Paris, no less. So I was quite astounded by the attention that it got from the political and diplomatic world. And then finally, or almost finally, as a real-world teaching resource, I think it can be a valuable tool. I have a colleague who's used the archive for a project that she gave to her first-year undergraduate students. And as I mentioned before, because these web objects are inherently multimodal, it means that you can develop and assess all 4 language skills. So reading, writing, speaking and listening potentially can be enhanced using this sort of material. And I think students find it engaging doing that sort of thing as well. So you could ask them to read a blog post written in French by a Londoner, so we're in an environment that they're probably familiar with, but not necessarily a community they're familiar with, and then ask them to write a comment in response to that blog, or something like that. So the possibilities for new sorts of learning materials are there. And as I hinted at then, it also gives visitors an alternative world view. We don't know who's going to look at this archive on the British Library website, but it could well be a native Londoner who will be given a window onto London from a first-hand diasporic perspective. And finally then, obviously the future historic impact is crucial here. So my collection will preserve long-term part of London's cultural heritage for future multidisciplinary scholarship and also future community members. So to conclude, I'd say that the web archiving community and the modern foreign languages research community actually have a kind of symbiotic relationship, or potentially could do. So the web archiving community needs modern foreign languages researchers. Again, this has been hinted at before, but I was at a major international web archiving conference last week, and several of the speakers mentioned language in their presentations and then never really addressed language when it came round to it. So I do think that as modern foreign languages, we have a unique set of skills there, and web archives do offer us an opportunity to apply them in a new way, and the web archivists are crying out for that kind of attention. Web archives need greater publicity and greater use. Lots of people still have no idea what a web archive is. Similarly, MFL researchers need original sites of investigation. So again, it's a win-win situation. Web archives need to enter the classroom or the trans lab, as Alexa Alpha refers to it, and language teachers need creative sources and resources. So in this image, I'm not sure who's who here. I'm guessing that the web archive is the crocodile and the bird is the modern foreign languages researcher. And I would say just dive in, don't be afraid, have a poke around and see what you can find.
Thank you. So we'll move on to our next speaker, who is Caroline Ardrey. Caroline is Research Associate on the AHRC-funded Baudelaire Song Project, directed by Professor Helen Abbott at the University of Birmingham. In December 2016, she received a European Research Award to conduct Visualising Voice, a digital humanities research tool which allows users to visualise and analyse spoken performances of 19th century French poetry. And her presentation is the title, Visualising Voices, Developing Linguistically Versatile Digital Audio Analysis Methods for Poetry and Performance.
So, although I've entitled this Developing Linguistically Versatile Digital Audio Analysis Methods for Poetry and Performance, I don't claim to have any answers as to how we can make our audio analysis linguistically versatile. So I'm hoping that some of you will have some ideas and this will come out a little bit through the questions. So as Paul mentioned, I currently work on two projects. First and foremost, I am Research Associate on the Baudelaire Song Project, which is led by Professor Helen Abbott at the University of Birmingham. And we're a four-strong team. So we work with Dr. Mylène Doubiot, who's based in musicology, and Dr. Caroline Potter, who's also based in French musicology at Kingston University. And then there's me. And then the other project that I work on, Visualising Voice, is a much smaller enterprise. This was a 6-month project with just under €8,000 behind it. So two very, very different projects. But I work with two different kinds of performance. So the Baudelaire Song Project kind of does what it says on the tin. So we look at the work of the 19th century French poet Charles Baudelaire. You've probably all heard of Baudelaire and know very well of Les Fleurs du Mal, which features on probably every undergraduate French course out there. And he also wrote prose poetry, Le Spleen de Paris. So my job is to bring together a database of all the known song settings of Baudelaire's poetry. And working with a 19th century French poet, you might expect to see Claude Debussy on there. You might expect to see Gabriel Fauré on there. But there's actually a lot more to Baudelaire in song than meets the eye. So as part of my research, I found death metal from the Soviet Union. I've found all sorts of rap. I've found sort of sugary pop music, awful power ballads and things. Sorry, I didn't make a value judgment there. They're not awful, they're lovely. But I found out a huge range of different songs. And the second part of my job is to come up with a way of analysing these digitally. So I work with two kind of digital aspects. I work with the digital methodology of how to analyse these songs. And I also work with the digital object of the MP3 file. And then there's the third strand, which is working with an old text by a dead white poet. Not to belittle Charles Baudelaire by any means. But the work that I do comes out of some digital sound and voice studies which are going on in the sphere of musicology. We've got Nicholas Cook, who looks at music as performance. And we've also got Daniel Leach-Wilkinson, who looks, again, at studying music in performance with a digital aspect, so at the Charm Lab, which is Queen Mary, University of London and Royal Holloway. And then in terms of the spoken performance of poetry, we've got Charles Bernstein. Oh, sorry, I think he's actually English, so English speaker, so Charles Bernstein, sorry, and Tanya Clement. So these people are more interested in spoken performances of poetry. So working on the Baudelaire Song Project, I come up with lovely visualizations like this. So this is a waveform of Baudelaire's poem Recueillement, which is meditation, and the markup of this, done in Sonic Visualizer, which was also developed by Queen Mary University of London, basically falls into 7 layers. So these funny little bars, which you might be able to see, are purple. They mark the beginnings and ends of every word. So the beginning and end of every word is time-stamped. We do the same for syllables. We do the same for the structure of the poem, so beginnings and ends of lines, beginnings and ends of stanzas, and we also mark on their punctuation. So we've got timestamps for all these things. And it turns out a little bit like that blue table there on the right. And you might ask, what is the point of this? Well, this helps us to create some kind of visualization and some data so that I can basically do a close reading of a song setting of a poem without a score. So I can kind of interpret this data to compare song settings and see which one maybe is faster, which one observes the punctuation, and which one observes the rules of French versification. And I have to credit the PI on the Baudelaire project, Helen Abbott, here for instilling in me a fascination with French versification, which may not sound like the most exciting thing in the world until you start to analyse it in really close detail. And then you realise that people like Debussy don't follow the rules of French versification. So the main thing that we've looked at in the Baudelaire project is the pronunciation of something which we call the mute E. So the caduc, which means that in a traditional Alexandrine, in a 12-syllable line, you will pronounce the E's on the ends of words if they're followed by a consonant, and not if they're followed by a vowel, broadly speaking. Now, Debussy doesn't follow this trend at all. He breaks with the conventions of French poetry by giving a whole note to an E which shouldn't be pronounced. And so I wanted to know really whether this trend had continued in popular music and in other genres. And actually I found that the later you got in pop music, this wasn't really happening, that it started to tend more either towards the rules of French versification or towards the conventions of ordinary speech, where we don't really worry about these E's on the ends of words at all. But I hypothesized that if in sung performance people broke with the conventions of French versification, then in spoken performance they would probably want to follow it. And so this visualization became a way of tracing reception histories through performance. And through the Baudelaire Song Project, identifying this gap to find out what happens in spoken performance, I applied for a grant from the Europeana Foundation to look at spoken performances of poetry. And with that, I was using resources based in Europeana collections. So for me, it was mainly the Bibliothèque Nationale. I was a bit disappointed to discover that actually the British Library doesn't have much spoken performance of poetry. In fact, most of what I could find from the British Library in Europeana was birdsong, which isn't very helpful for me. It was nice to hear a chaffinch and everything, but I can't really analyse that as poetry. Because what I wanted to do was to move away from French poetry, away from the conventions of French versification, and see what happened when we tried to put these visualization techniques into another language. But so far, I haven't been able to do that, and I found some kind of challenges along the way. But to go back to the Baudelaire Song Project visualizations, you can see that they don't really mean that much to the average user. And so when I started my own project, Visualising Voice, I really wanted to move away from this very academic model of visualization, which was just mainly for me as an academic to help me write some articles and to try and automate a process. Instead, I wanted to come up with something which was dynamic, that was interesting for the general user, and that encouraged people to engage with audio archives. And so I worked with Tom Cowley, who's a software developer. He's not an academic software developer, so he's not to be found in a digital humanities department somewhere. He works mainly in ed tech, so he was used to making kind of pedagogical tools. And that was really important for me. It turned out to be a personal acquaintance which worked really well in terms of creating a collaboration which brought academia into a kind of public sphere. So this visualization aims to do what the Baudelaire project does, in a sense, but on a much smaller, simpler, and more accessible scale, and to get other people to be able to try it for themselves. I didn't want to stick with just Baudelaire, and there are a couple of reasons for that. First and foremost, that there weren't that many recordings of poems by Baudelaire in Europeana collections. So this is one big problem I found with audio analysis, that the data to work on, or the sources to work on, just aren't available publicly. And this is partly an issue of availability, but I think it's prompted mainly by legal and copyright issues. So I decided to pick out two other 19th century French poets who I've worked on previously, Paul Verlaine and Arthur Rimbaud, and to try and create a sort of database of 19th century French poetry in a way. So rather than me talking, if you have a laptop, please feel free to go to visualisingvoice.eu, and I foolishly didn't put the web address on there, but if you go to Visualising Voice with an S, .eu and log in, then you can actually have a play around with it for yourselves. If not now, then later on. But for now, I'd quite like to show you how this works. So here we have a visualization, which I'm not going to play because this is me reading it, and it makes me cringe every time I do it. But instead, I will show you the recordings. So here we've got 27 recordings, 3 poems by the 3 poets. So I'll take Baudelaire's L'Albatros, and we can see we've got the poem text here. We created it so that you had the syllables marked up kind of internally, but you couldn't see them unless you wanted to edit them. So I could add in an extra syllable here, for example. But I think what you should be able to see is where this E is pronounced. So we've got the word l'autre, which is in 2 syllables because it's being followed by consonant. And that's really important to see who pronounces this as l'autre and who pronounces it as l'autre, on 1 syllable, because if you pronounce it differently, you change the whole syllabic pattern of the poem. So if we look then at our recording, this is Hosti que Jean Marchas. It's a recording from 1958. And these blocks are supposed to be like a sort of histogram. So the length of the block is the length of the syllable. The height of the block is the intensity or the volume at which he speaks. So the idea is not only can you see all the syllables, you can also see how much emphasis we have on a certain part of speech. So here, hopefully we should be able to hear it.
Souvent, pour s'amuser, les hommes d'équipage prennent des albatros.
So the reason this is useful to me as somebody studying poetry is that I can tell straight away where the pauses are. So we've got this 12-syllable Alexandrine. I can see that he makes a big pause after 6 syllables. He really makes much of that caesura. You can also see that he pauses after the word souvent, meaning often, as if kind of, pausing for breath. And then at the end of the first line, we have a little break. So he doesn't follow this on. We don't see any enjambment. We can then compare this against, let's compare it against me and see how I do. So I'm kind of following pretty much the same pattern here, but true to form, I'm speaking quite a lot faster than he is. Mine's a lot more squashed up. My pauses are a lot smaller. I can add in somebody else. Let's add in Alain Cuny, who does the same. Let's go for Alexandre Regnault, who does it differently. So here we can see that actually Alexandre Regnault does not split this into 3 parts. He just has quite a clear break. So the first part of the Alexandrine, second part of the Alexandrine, and then at the end of the line, he carries straight on with no pause, so making use of the enjambment. And I'm able to tell all of this about the recording without actually listening to it because I've got the visualization here. And I can edit individual texts as well. But this isn't all completely automated, sadly for me, because I had to go and mark these up. But what we've improved upon from the Baudelaire project markup is the ability to automate this as much as possible. So I have an auto-add function here, which uses the heights of the bars to try and guess where the breaks in the words are, which was massively labour-saving for me, because when I've been marking up for the Baudelaire Song Project, listening to a song, I've had to mark every syllable, I've had to slow things down, I've had to move things around, and it's really quite a labour-intensive process. And if I wanted this to be user-friendly, I wanted people to be able to do it for themselves. So if I just play you this, you can see.
Souvent pour s'amuser.
But I can change this. I can change the way the syllables fall, and I can save it, or I cannot. And also, I can change the way that the syllables are marked up. So, for example, if I find that he pronounces the word agace as 2 syllables instead of agace, then I can change that myself. So the plan with Visualising Voice was to allow other people to upload their own recordings, to be able to practice their language skills, and to be able to compare the way they perform poetry against other people. So, going back to PowerPoint. What we've actually found is that there is quite a lot to be done in the sphere of audio analysis, both using it as a pedagogical tool and as an academic kind of methodology. So I've kind of touched on the idea of public engagement. I'm not going to pretend that Visualising Voice is perfect, but hopefully it's a step in the right direction to making audio analysis a bit more accessible and a little bit more mainstream. The question of how to standardise the methodology comes down to different languages, because I don't have expertise in all the languages that I would like to. So people in the Russian department are probably quite sick of me knocking on their door to analyse Soviet song. And I did take a Russian class in this. But I think this is what seems to be emerging from a lot of the presentations today, that when we want to deal with material in other languages, we need to seek help from other people. So I think it's very important that we all get together and discuss this as linguists from different language disciplines, as well as from different areas of modern languages. We also, in terms of audio analysis of song, we need to work together with colleagues from musicology to look at features of music. So I think this is a particular problem of audio analysis, is that we have another different discipline open to us. I found, particularly with Visualising Voice, that the quality of recordings affects the accuracy of the output. So if you go to the front page of Visualising Voice, where I've done a test recording for you, you'll find that there's one block which is far too tall for the way it sounds, and that was because I was moving my chair in the kitchen when I recorded it. But I think that it kind of flagged up an important point for me, that actually the quality of the audio analysis really affects the results, and we need to kind of check those for accuracy and work out if there's ways that we can make it better. The biggest barrier to me in the Visualising Voice project, though, was probably ethical issues and legal issues. So ethical issues in terms of crowd sourcing other people's recordings. We then had to go through an ethics committee to look at where we were going to store these recordings, and for the purposes of a 6-month project, it just became too much. And the obvious one being copyright and legal issues. So while we wanted to make these visualizations publicly available, we weren't allowed to host the recordings, which means that we had to, for the purposes of this, I'm allowed to show you the Albatros recording, but ordinarily you'd have to go to the Europeana site and find the recording for yourself and get it through their channels, which makes it really difficult to integrate text and performance, which is at heart the whole point of the project. So how to build in linguistic versatility with difficulty and with caution. So I think even with simplifications and even with all these problems, this still has something to tell us about poetry and performance. I would never have known, for example, that spoken performances of poetry are as liberal with the pronunciation and the conventions of French versification as song at times. I would also never have realised that there was such a diversity of different recordings within one very small historical period. So imagine what we could do if copyright allowed us access to a greater variety of recordings. As I've mentioned, we need to work with specialists in poetry and in linguistics and in different languages, and to collaborate amongst ourselves to make this more work for everybody and to make it a more mainstream aspect of the humanities research and the digital humanities. And I hope that you will have questions, thoughts, ideas that you can bring to this to help make audio analysis a more mainstream aspect of digital humanities. Thank you.